Hello everybody, and welcome back to another video. In today's video, we'll be taking a look at the state of New Jersey, and I'll be talking about some expectations for next week, some early voting updates, and just in general what's been happening here. So, as I talked about in my previous video, which was also specifically about New Jersey, I think Democrats, just to get into this, are in a really bad position here. And I'm not saying that I think they're going to lose or that they're on the brink of disaster here, but I do think that of all the states to have gubernatorial elections, or that could have gubernatorial elections, right? New Jersey is one of the worst states in terms of just trends and political dynamics for Democrats right now. Now, I think the big problem that Democrats have, and I've articulated this a bunch throughout, the past, I'd say 9 months, is that they don't have an identity. And you can say, well, they're fighting Trump, and, that might be true, and, Trump isn't the most popular president. I recognize that, and, that gives Democrats a reasonably high floor of support. But to win elections, especially in states that are getting closer or in states that are swing states, right, you have to do more than that. And I think part of why Democrats were successful in 2018 was, yes, Donald Trump wasn't super popular, but he wasn't as unpopular as Biden was in 2022, for example. He had decent ratings in the economy, which was one of the most important issues of that cycle. No, the reason Democrats did well in 2018 was because they had an identity and it was tied to healthcare. And they don't have, I think, any offense this year. They're playing defense on Trump, which could help them, but they don't have any offense. And so I think when you look at states, and, that can work sometimes, it can also not work other times. And I think that states where Democrats have been doing worse in the past 5 to 7 years are the places where Democrats need offense. They need something to change because Democrats have been opposing Trump since 2016. And in that time period, New Jersey has only gotten redder. So I think Democrats need something else. They need something new. They need, something that they can advocate for themselves in order to win back the voters that are drifting away from them. Because, it's one thing for Democrats to run on the anti-Trump platform in, say, a left-trending suburb that has gotten bluer since 2016, right? Like maybe do that in Richmond, Virginia, or maybe in North Dallas, Texas, okay? But if you're looking at a state like New Jersey, which, as I said, has gotten 10 points redder since Trump came on the scene in 2016, maybe not. And, I've been pretty critical of Mikey Sherrill's campaign. I don't think it's been terrible. She hasn't really had any, huge, baggage moments or scandals, but I don't think it's been as good as it could be because I don't think that there's an identity for it the same way that there has been. And you can think of this for Republicans too, right? Like this is kind of a little tangent that I just want to get out of the way to start the video because I'm going to talk about it inevitably, right? But go back to 2021. Glenn Youngkin won that race, yes, in part because in Virginia, Biden wasn't super popular and, the economy was getting worse and there was some, I think there's a little bit of residual anger over some of the COVID stuff, which exit polls showed was somewhat controversial in Virginia, right? Those dynamics helped Glenn Youngkin, but Glenn Youngkin would not have won if he didn't have his own identity. His own identity was that he was a reasonable moderate Republican who really cared about education and really cared about giving parents a say in their children's education. That became the big issue the final month and a half of that campaign. I don't think we have that for the Mikey Sherrill versus Jack Ciattarelli campaign, right? In Virginia, maybe you could argue that it's been social issues for Spanberger versus Earl Sears, but in New Jersey, I don't really think we have that either way. And that works to Ciattarelli's advantage just because, he's I think at least been louder on his, main issue, which is that, he thinks the cost of living is too high and the taxes are too high and, it's unsustainable, right? And I don't think that, to be fair to Ciattarelli, I don't think he's run that argument maybe as well as Youngkin ran the education argument just because it doesn't seem to be gaining the same level of traction. But at least he's, doing something, right? With Sherrill, I don't see the vision necessarily. And that's why I think this is a bad race for Democrats. Now, with all of that being said, given the, having gotten my opinions on the state of campaign and the fact that New Jersey is a right-trending state out of the way, Democrats are still favored in this race. Mikey Sherrill should still probably be the next governor of New Jersey. She's led in basically every poll. Some of them are close, some of them are not as close, but for the most part, it's been pretty, solid for her in the polling. Now, what I want to do is I want to start by looking at the 2021 election, and then I want to look at some early vote data, courtesy of votehub.us, which is tracking early votes, that have been returned, especially mail-in ballots. I'd say right now the early vote data, it's mostly inconclusive, but Democrats do have some good signs there. So we'll talk about that in a second. But we're going to start, like I said, in 2021, where if you look at this map, you'll see a very close election that kind of, looks a little bit more like 2024 than it did like 2020. You have to remember in 2020, Biden won New Jersey by 16 points, and then this was just 12 months later, Chitterelli came within 3.2% of winning and being the next governor of New Jersey. This was a shock race to a lot of people. A lot of people, I think, on the Democratic side were kind of asleep at the wheel. Murphy didn't really expect a competitive race. Turnout wasn't that great. And Chitterelli, ran a really, really close race here. And he did this because of a couple things. First of all, turnout, like I said, was down in Essex and Hudson counties. These are deep blue counties, as you can see. Obviously, Phil Murphy won them decisively, but turnout was down, right? And in a lot of these counties, the bigger problem is turnout, right? Democrats, if they win these counties 75 to 25, turnout increases of 10 to 12% or decreases of 10 to 12% can really have a big impact statewide. And that worked against Murphy. And then Murphy also did quite poorly in South Jersey. He did really well in South Jersey in 2017, but he lost a lot of these kind of working class, blue-collar voters, especially white voters down here. Maybe even voted for him last time, but voted for Chitterelli pretty decisively in 2021. And I think most surprisingly was that Morris County, this is, a textbook, suburban, left-trending county. It voted for Biden in 2020 by about 4%. It goes for Jack Chitterelli by 11. So we saw a 15-point swing, more than that, in Morris County, New Jersey, which was definitely very interesting. And this really showed, maybe you could argue that, the Murphy gain or the Chitterelli gains in South Jersey with working class voters were kind of okay. That makes sense because white working class voters without college degrees have been getting more conservative in the past 10, 15 years. Okay, that's fine. But in Morris County, these are affluent suburban voters who, for the most part, have been in the Trump era have been trending left. And Chitterelli, really does a full 180 on that and makes this county red by double digits again. And so New Jersey 2021 was kind of this, really decisive rightward shift. And at the time, a lot of people said, okay, well, Democrats were asleep at the wheel. Does it really matter? Maybe they'll just be more careful next time. But indeed, in 2024, we saw a lot of the same problems. Actually, Kamala Harris did a lot worse than Phil Murphy in Newark, in the Newark region. She did better than him in Morris County. She only lost it by a couple points instead of 11. But we still saw Morris County go red. We still saw Donald Trump make a lot of gains in South Jersey as well. And so overall, this election, I think, was not a fluke. It was indicative of, what Republicans are capable of doing in New Jersey. And now in 2025, even though Donald Trump is president, even though he's not super popular in New Jersey, I think Democrats really should be, and they have been, to be fair. This is a race that I think is legitimately going to be interesting to watch for that reason, because we've seen what can happen before. Now, let's talk about the early vote data, because I think when you look at this, you get some interesting trends. So again, what we can do is we can look at the requests, and as you can see, right, just go to, like any of these counties, Democrats do, in terms of percentages, out request Republicans just because Democrats vote by mail more often. But if we look at the actual votes cast, we can see that the picture gets a little clearer. And we can do this by municipality, by the way, but, realistically, I don't think it's productive to go through every town in New Jersey, so we're just going to do it by county. So what we can do is we can look at, some of these counties, right? And a good example of this would be Ocean County, which is the reddest county in the state. This is a deeply Republican county. Chitterelli got, 68% of the vote here in 2021. He won it, by, that looks like around 80,000 votes, a little less than that, 80,000 votes, right? That's, a big net to have. That's, more than, it's actually pretty similar to the amount that Murphy won Essex County by. So this is kind of like the equivalent to that for Republicans. Ocean County, as we can see, Democrats outpacing Republicans a little bit here, right? 61% of mail-in ballots requested by registered Democrats have been returned. Republicans are at 54%. It's not a huge gap, but what I think what we kind of can see is that overall, Democrats, are not having a super big turnout problem. They're running a little bit ahead of Republicans, which is a good sign for them. And then, obviously, Hudson and Essex County, these are bigger concerns for Democrats. Turnout isn't that high from either party. But Democrats are ahead of Republicans. I think overall this is a little bit more concerning for Democrats than their numbers in Ocean County, just because the turnout's not really that high in general. Similar story overall in, similar story overall, although it's a little bit better in Essex County. Again, Phil Murphy won this county decisively in 2021. It will vote for Mikey Sherrill by probably a similar amount. We'll check back in on that on election night, obviously, but Democrats being below 50% here isn't great, but it's not nearly as concerning as I would say. Obviously, Hudson County is, where they're at 45. And then if we go to Morris County, which we were just talking about, turnout's a little higher here. I think Republicans are keeping pace reasonably well. They're only behind by 0.8%, which is solid for them. It's a lot less concerning than Ocean County, where, right, like Ocean County, they're behind by 8% in one of the reddest parts of the state in terms of return rate. So that's just something to consider. It looks like Republicans in the suburbs are turning out, but that also, is mostly because in off-year elections like this one, the suburbs generally drop off in turnout by the least amount, right? Like when you look at this election here, turnout was down across the state because obviously fewer people vote in odd year gubernatorial elections than even year presidential elections. But if you compare the turnout drops were a lot smaller in Morris County than they were in, say, Newark, right? That's just kind of the rule of thumb. And, the same applies to a lesser extent in rural areas, right? Like in Sussex and Warren, I think turnout dropped by a little bit less than Morris, but 2021 was just a really good environment for Republicans in general. So turnout in these counties didn't really drop by that much in general. It was mostly it was pretty asymmetric. And turnout in 2021, which really hurt Phil Murphy, dropped by far the most in Newark. So, that's something you have to consider. And then, looking ahead to Sussex County or Warren County, like I mentioned, pretty even. Sussex County is a little bit better for Democrats than Warren County is, but these are two rural counties. They don't cast a ton of votes, right? As you can see, Jack Ciattarelli netted 11,000 out of Warren and 18,000 out of Sussex, or 19,000 out of Sussex, but not nearly as big as Ocean County. So then we have to go to South Jersey, where things are looking okay for Democrats, right? I'm surprised by how well they've been keeping pace here, to be honest. I think South Jersey is probably going to be the part of Jersey that swings the most towards Ciattarelli, just because it's so right trending, because there's so many working class voters, and the Democratic base in Camden really didn't turn out that well last year. We saw Kamala Harris do a lot worse in Camden than Joe Biden did. And so Camden County is actually pretty high turnout. This is higher than I would have anticipated. GOP at 62, Democrats nearly 64. That's solid for Democrats, I would say, just because they have a bit of a lead here. And then, in these other counties that are more conservative, these are kind of like light red counties. Democrats, not doing too great in Cumberland County. And like I said, as expected, South Jersey, Democrats aren't doing nearly as well as they are in other parts of the state, which is why I do expect this to be the worst part of the state for them, relative to last time at least. They're behind in Atlantic. They're behind in Cumberland. Salem, they're also behind. And then if you look at Cape May, which is the smallest county, I believe, by population. Interesting. Cape May is bigger than Cumberland. I didn't realize that. And Salem. Okay. My apologies. For some reason, I thought Cape May was smaller than Cumberland, but I think roughly the size of Salem. Regardless, Cape May is the only one of these counties, right, where Democrats are maintaining a bit of an advantage. So that does kind of corroborate what I've been saying, which is that in 2021, the biggest swings against Phil Murphy came in South Jersey, especially like Atlantic City and kind of these areas outside of Camden. What we're seeing could be another version of that, where even though Democrats are turning out a bit higher than Republicans in most of the state, or at least early, it's not the case in South Jersey. So that's a bit of an ominous sign, although it would be biased of me to say, like, oh, this is a bad sign for Republicans, while also saying this is a bad sign for Democrats down here, while also not saying that Democrats do have some good things going on in North and Central Jersey. Then the one thing I will note is that Camden, interestingly, looks pretty solid for Democrats, even though the neighboring counties do not. So that's kind of where we're at. And I think overall, right, like we have to consider is that early voting is hard to draw conclusions from. That's why I'm not saying, oh, this has changed my outlook on the race. I'm just kind of showing, what's happening and whether or not candidates are probably happy with that. I think this early voting is consistent with a decently close race, right? This is an off-year election, so you'd expect it's one in the Trump era, so you might expect Democrats to turn out at higher rates than Republicans. That is happening statewide. As you can see, statewide, Democrats do have a bit of an advantage, but it's not by too much. And that's the thing that's going to be interesting to watch. Is that obviously Democrats should have a turnout advantage this year for the same reason Republicans had one in 2021, but right now it doesn't seem to be like a huge turnout advantage. So I would say this is consistent with a reasonably close election where Ciattarelli has a shot, but not really like a huge shot, kind of an outside chance, I would say. And I would also say that, to be fair to Mikey Sherrod, this race shows that she hasn't lost total control. This doesn't seem like a at least a pattern that's shaping up to favor Jack Ciattarelli outright. But it definitely doesn't, indicate like a Democratic blowout the way we saw in 2017, where Phil Murphy won by almost 15 points. One more thing I will say is that the reason that early voting we can only draw so many conclusions is that obviously this isn't the pandemic anymore. We have election day voting, and I think that Republicans in general, as we know, tend to vote more on election day, especially in the North. It's a bit less so the case in, say, Texas or Florida or Georgia, but in New Jersey definitely is the case. The Republicans like to vote on election day. And what that means is that if there is a Republican turnout drop, the way we saw a Democratic turnout drop in 2021, we might not know until 4 p.m. on election day, because the people who are going to proactively request mail-in ballots are probably higher turnout Republican voters who are going to vote in most elections. The Republican voters who are maybe lower propensity, who only came out for Donald Trump in 2024, right? They might not vote at all, and we wouldn't know that until election day. So I would say there's still like a better chance that Sherrod does end up winning by a little more than expected based on this, just because she's not behind by too much right now, and because Democrats still have a reasonable turnout pace with Republicans. But we again, we're not going to know that till election day. So just consider that as you will. So thanks for watching. I'm happy to check in on these races. We have less than a week to go until election day. Be sure to vote if you are over the age of 18, an American citizen. I am voting, obviously. I'll probably vote on election day. I think it's kind of fun, and the lines won't be too long because it's an off-year election. Obviously vote in every election, but especially vote in these elections because fewer people turn out, so your vote is, mathematically it's worth a little bit more. That's the way I like to think about it. And by the way, it's not only Virginia and New Jersey that have these races. You have other races, like my state. I don't have a race for governor, but I do have some local races that I'll be voting in. So be sure to show up and vote early or on election day, which is Tuesday, November 4th. So thanks for watching. Let me know what you think about New Jersey, and I'll see you all next time.